Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a great webinar on tap today, as always, but before we get started, we do have some housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, just know you'll be able to listen to it afterwards on demand. Following today's webinar, we'll be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience throughout today's webinar. So if at any time you have a question for our speaker, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. And as we go along, sure we'll get some questions answered during the actual presentation. And also at the end of today's webinar, we are going to be doing a drawing for 3 $50 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around and we'll do that random drawing at the end of the webinar. Hopefully you'll be one of our 3 lucky winners. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is open source testing, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Our speaker today is Elise Carmichael, who is VP Enterprise Evangelist at TryCentos. Hi, Elise, how are you?
I'm great, Charlene. How are you?
Doing swell, thanks. I know you've got a lot to go over, so I'm going to put myself on mute and let you get right into it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So you are all at the right place. If you care about the world of testing and open source, I'll talk about exactly what the title says, the good, bad, and the ugly of using open source tools. So let me just introduce myself really quickly, since I will be talking at myself for the next hour. Like Charlene said, please ask questions. I'm going to reiterate that in a second. So I've been at TryCentos about 2 years, but I was actually a customer prior to joining. In my previous role, I ran engineering and testing at a services company and had a need for centralized reporting and test case management. So we actually brought in what's now called TryCentos Q-Test. And it was previously part of a company called QA Symphony, which merged with TryCentos about a year ago. So just so you know, my background going through these open source topics is that I am at heart a software developer, have done a little bit of testing, have done a lot of development and technical leading and running of projects from a technical standpoint. And like I said, I will always be a software developer, even though I don't do it necessarily day to day, but I still do it for fun on the regular. So I have worked in a variety of industries, from technical to finance to healthcare, e-commerce, construction, even trucking. So I've been a little bit all over the place. So I'd love to get your questions across any of these industries. Let me make sure I can, there we go. So like I said, ask questions, put it in the question box. So let me tell you a little bit about TryCentos. This is where I work and who is putting on this webinar today for you. So TryCentos was founded as a services company in 2007, but several years later delivered the first product called TryCentos Task. So this is our flagship scriptless automation solution. And you may say, hey, we're talking about open source here, so I promise I will get there in just a second. But all of our products at TryCentos, we have quite a few, they all focus on testing and automation. We really want to just increase the test automation rate, speed to market, application risk coverage, and this includes any kind of open source technology that you choose. We don't just offer our automation tool, but we have more than 1,600 customers worldwide, and we have some of the largest customers in each of these industries: banking, finance, energy, utilities, telcos, and so on. And I don't like reading through all these slides, but I will point out that we have a number of products. You see that we merged with a company called QA Symphony in 2018. We acquired a product called QUp. Actually, more recently, we acquired a product called Live Compare, which does impact analysis on SAP, and another product called Test Project, which helps with web and mobile automation. You'll also see Flood on this list that does load and performance testing. There's quite a bit to it, but I do want to point out that we are industry recognized in Gartner and Forrester in Magic Quadrants as well-known leaders in the automation space. Okay, now that I've told you a little bit about our company, we'll get into the open source topic, the good, the bad, and the ugly. All right, so I'm going to start with the good, as we should. And the greatest thing about the open source frameworks is there are many, many of them. So I've broken them down in a few categories. So the security category, SonarQube, is extraordinarily popular. It's also code analysis, not just security. Load and performance, there's a number of very popular tools. Functional UI and API testing tools, there's quite a few of those, and some accessibility tools. But what you'll notice when I evaluated all of the types of tools that are most popular in kind of each category, there are far and away the most functional UI testing tools. That is by far the most popular type. And with that, the vast majority run under Selenium, or they run using Selenium. And if you're not familiar with Selenium, I'm guessing most of you on the call have heard of Selenium if you're not already using it. It's a way to interact with a web browser. It's a set of protocols you can use to help control the browser. And I wanted to give you a little bit of update on what is going on in the Selenium world. So Selenium 4.0 is the latest iteration. It's not quite released yet. It's just in this alpha and beta stage. So I just looked this up the other day. It was just released as a beta on July 1st, but it's not like a full-fledged release. The code was tagged, which means the open source developers, whoever was contributing to this product, someone decided to tag the code base and say, okay, this bit of code is ready to be beta tested. And you'll see with open source tools, there are constant improvements. There are a lot of contributors to Selenium. You can look at the GitHub repository and see exactly how many people have contributed. And this is pros and minuses. Sometimes you'll have a company sort of sponsor an open source tool to help pay for developers' time to commit things. But you don't necessarily have someone who's owning, the documentation of it or press releases. It was actually very difficult to find this information of like when releases were coming out of Selenium, because no one, fully owns the same that belongs to the community. So that's one thing you have to be okay with if you're going to be using an open source framework. And I will point out that TryCentos uses a lot of open source tooling and frameworks internally. So just because we have our own automation tools, we use whatever makes sense on the project we're doing. So one of the really exciting things with Selenium 4.0 is this W3C standardized WebDriver. So you may have heard of this WebDriver tool. Like I said, feel free to put comments in the chat here if you have no idea what I'm talking about. So WebDriver is this interface that allows Selenium to basically control the browser, and it runs like a service. This is how Sauce Labs and other companies can support running Selenium against their own browsers. They kind of stand up this WebDriver, and you just point to the appropriate WebDriver running on Sauce Labs or whatever other tool that you're using like that, or you can run it locally, of course. But what this means is that the newer versions of browsers like Chrome and Safari will actually support that WebDriver protocol internally in the browser. This means that you don't necessarily have to use a separate service like this WebDriver service to control the browser. This is a huge, huge deal to me. And this right here is going to show me that Selenium is the way to go. If you're not sure about using Selenium versus other tools to help you do browser-based testing, this to me makes it a clear winner. So that's pretty exciting. Also, as part of Selenium 4.0, they have Selenium grid enhancements so you can better run your tests in parallel. They have a focus on, I say they, like the Selenium community has a focus on not just the end users, but there are a lot of companies and tools that use Selenium behind the scenes. And they kind of market their tools as codeless Selenium. So there's a lot more support for tools like that. So just more standardization in Selenium. And then they are also enhancing the Selenium IDE. So if any of you were doing Selenium development, I don't know, maybe 8 years ago or so, you would have in, say, Firefox, the Selenium IDE, you could record your tests in the browser and play it back. And it was kind of cool that it existed, but also kind of terrible because it was not a great way to design an automation framework. But they are making this and bringing it back and making it a lot better to support things like parallel execution. And they claim better documentation, but I will believe this when I see it. All right, next up, Cypress. This is kind of, I'll say, the new hotness for what I keep hearing. A lot of our customers are coming to me and saying, hey, do you support Cypress in the TryCentos toolset? I'll say, yes, we do. It's new and it's getting a little more traction. We support it at TryCentos because it's just JavaScript, and it uses the Mocha test framework, which is a very popular JavaScript test framework. It does not use Selenium. So this to me is kind of a giant red flag given what I just said about Selenium 4.0 and how popular Selenium is. But because it doesn't use Selenium, they can do a couple of things. So one, they have a nice interface. You could do that regardless. But because they don't use Selenium, they have better support for modern web technologies and mobile. So things like swiping and some of that kind of modern stuff you might be doing on your phone works a little bit better just because Selenium doesn't support it super well. It's also free and open source, but they do have a paid commercial edition where I believe you get better reporting and things like that. So it's kind of a neat thing to check out. Like I said, we've had a lot of customers look at it, ask me about it. Only a couple have really adopted it, but I know a lot of companies are evaluating it. So the next one I wanted to bring up is behavior-driven development. So this is not a new concept. But it has become increasingly popular way to bridge communication gaps. And all the frameworks that people really use for behavior-driven development are open source. Cucumber is by far the most popular one. If you're not familiar with behavior-driven development, then please ask a question. But I think this is, if you've been staying up to date with testing methodologies, this is a pretty popular one. So of our customers, we did a survey. About 34% of our customers say they plan to do some sort of automation. Actually, this wasn't our survey. This was a TechWell survey in 2018. But 34% claim they do some sort of automation using this BDD methodology. And of those 34%, 97% were using Cucumber. So that's kind of an interesting statistic. There are a number of other frameworks like JBehave and things like that, but not a whole lot of adoption. There is a bit of a problem with adoption. So a lot of companies start on this or they go towards it, but it's a really hard thing to get full buy-in into. It's not just how you're writing code. It's not just how you're writing the tests with this given, when, then syntax. You really have to get buy-in from the people writing the requirements, from the developers, and everyone has to use that given, when, then, and Cucumber gherkin syntax as the source of truth for requirements. That's the way that I've seen it be successful, is instead of writing out your requirements and then having the testers go write the gherkin, if you have the person writing the requirements write the gherkin, you're much more likely to be successful. Okay. So next topic is free versus open source. This is a bit of a pet peeve of mine because just because it is free does not mean it's open source. So if it's not open source and you're looking at free software, you are subject to whatever the company who owns that software wants to give you. Or you might not be using a full-fledged version of that product. There are some products that limit you in certain ways, like might limit your speed or may make it unmaintainable in the long term if you use the free version. So that's just something I wanted to point out. So if you're using an open source tool or application, you should be able to see the code of that tool, and you should be able to fork the code, take the code, modify the code, and you can't rely on anyone else to do something for you. So you'll see this problem, say with Appium. Appium, is based on like the Selenium kind of framework, but it's for mobile testing. When a new version of an operating system for mobile comes out, so say iOS 13 is coming out, Appium does not always support that new iOS version before it comes out. So if your company is reliant on verifying the newest operating system the day it comes out, you can't rely on a tool, on an open source framework to get you there. You'd have to rely on the native framework of whatever the operating system is. So for mobile, it might be XC UI test or something like that, something built into Apple. But if it is open source and you wanted to support iOS 13 the day it comes out, you are welcome to do it all by yourself. Your company could do it, and you're not subject to some companies staying in business or that company's generosity to develop on this open source project. So that is the great thing about open source, is you could do it all yourself if you want to. If it's just free, you might or might not get updates, so who knows. All right, so I love using open source. At TryCentos, like I said, we use a lot of open source tools. We use a lot of free tools. We use a lot of proprietary tools. We very much believe in the best of breed approach. We are going to use the best tool for that job. We use Tosca, of course, which is our scriptless automation tool. We use Protractor for doing Angular testing, so that's a JavaScript testing tool. We use SonarQube, we use Postman, which is a free but not open source tool, and so much more. So keep in mind, like I said, I write code in my spare time, so I'm a developer. I love open source. It's free. I can do it at home whenever I want. I have no problem committing to an open source tool either. So if you are going to take on, an open source testing framework and project at your organization, here is how I would recommend that you get started or modify your tool. So here are my 4 pro tips. So use the language that the rest of the team uses would be number 1. It's often that you have amazing test engineers who could also be developers on the engineering side, but they choose to be in testing. That's great. It's not always the case. And the more people who can understand the framework, the better. So if you use kind of the most popular programming languages that your company uses, you'll have the best support and long-term maintenance. So Java is by far the most popular tool that we see in terms of testing. It's also a very popular engineering tool, especially on the services side. JavaScript and Python would be next. Go and Ruby, I have seen a handful of times in the last couple of years, but they're becoming a lot less, cool or hip maybe in the testing world, but Java by far. You'll also see C# too. I'm not sure why I didn't put it on here, but C# is probably about as popular as JavaScript, or maybe a little bit more so. So pro tip number 2, use the page object model design pattern for the easiest possible maintenance. So this is the kind of thing where, the developer changes the ID of a field, you only should have to really change it in one place. So if you don't know what this is and you have an open source framework, you should very much look into it. It's just kind of an object-oriented way to do software testing projects. Pro tip number 3, have multiple test engineers understand the entire code base, not just one person. I call this the bus hitting principle. It is a real thing. If you Google getting hit by a bus and a developer, it's not, I didn't just make it up, and I'm not a terrible person. I swear I don't want anyone to get hit by a bus. I had that happen with someone that I hired at a previous job where they got really upset with me because I made them check in their code before they left work for the day because I said, what if you get hit by a bus? But it's a real thing. Many people should understand it in case they quit, not get hit by a bus. And then pro tip number 4, this is code. So it is another project, another engineering project. You're going to invest into it the same way you invest in any other engineering project at the company, and you should follow the same rules and methodologies that they follow. So this includes continuous integration, using tools like Jenkins or Bamboo or TeamCity or whatever, Azure DevOps. It includes version controlling this. Every test engineer, if they're doing any kind of open source custom framework, absolutely should be version controlling everything. They should be following good practices. Someone else should be code reviewing what they're doing. They should be doing security scans. And anytime you're running your own code, you should really have the basic scan set up in the same pipeline that you might set up for a project. You just don't have to deploy it into production. So that's kind of the beauty of it. All right. So before I get to the bad, I see at least one question here. So it is about SonarQube. So let's see, Kieran asked, SonarQube and cloud coverage, does that cover nearly all security points in white source? What kind of black box security should we use? And please suggest tools. That's kind of a tough question. There's quite a few tools. I don't know of open source ones off of the top of my head. So the question's about black box security testing and what tools there are. So I would need to look into that one. You can definitely just look up open source security tools, and you can probably be taken to the OWASP site, OWASP. They're kind of the leaders in security, and they would have all of them listed there. Okay, so let's talk about the bad. So the thing is, with open source tools and frameworks, you're completely on your own. You don't have a company backing you. So I have this really pretty background image on the screen because I guess this was in the late 90s. I made my first website on GeoCities. and I thought background images were really cool. I also had a lot of link tags and like those under construction cones because everyone else had it. And what you'll see in a lot of open source tools, and even some that you all probably use who are listening to me now, is some of this code is just like really, really outdated. Jenkins is probably one that screams outdated to me. It's not necessarily how it functions, it's the user interface. Like nothing has changed in it. Maybe that's not so bad. It works and does what it needs to, but it screams of something that was written in like 2004. That's about when it was written. So you have to deal with it yourself. Poor documentation, like I said with Selenium, is really hard to find what is coming out, what's new, how things work. But you do have a great community. So if you get a popular open source framework that you're using and it has a great community, you can usually ask questions and someone will know. But generally speaking, open source projects have like the worst documentation. Upgrades, the tools may or may not have security things built in or upgrading built in. So you might have to be proactive and pull upgrades. And if you're going to be using open source tools, so say on your engineering project, you're using a bunch of open source tools, we do this too, you should have an open source security scanning tool that will tell you, hey, this this version of this open source tool or library that you're using has a security vulnerability. Before I move on, I will tell you and remind you of the Heartbleed security problem. It was a bug in open source OpenSSL crypto library. It's something that someone could have known about and could have told anyone who was subject to that about. Same thing with Equifax, and I'm not sure about the Target issue, but you have to be really careful when you use these kinds of tools that you don't introduce something bad into your network. And like I touched on this a minute ago, but tools like Appium aren't always just the cutting edge, most up-to-date thing unless you're supporting it. And Appium is even pretty well supported by a number of different companies. So even the well-supported ones, it's sometimes kind of hard to get the up-to-date engagement that you need at a corporate level. So the other thing about open source tools is, although the tool itself is free, it is another engineering project, and it is not actually free to develop an open source framework that you're going to start using company-wide. So when you're looking at choosing these, you should really be calculating the cost of what this will actually run you. So you have to create the framework, maintain the framework, you have to get upgrades for the framework. You have to have the right staff in training. This is maybe the hardest part of this to get adoption company-wide. A lot of companies have gone to the, I want to have only developers doing testing and development. That can work out pretty well, but it's also really hard to find that many developers in one area to work on something. And then, of course, the test machine management, orchestration, and maintenance of the machines has a cost associated to it. You might need your DevOps engineers to help get this set up. If you want to run tests in parallel, you have to figure out how to orchestrate all these things in parallel if it's not built into the cost of ownership whenever you're choosing a new tool or tool set. If it's open source, that's great. Just you'll want to keep this in mind. So what I'd like to do is take a quick step back and look at what we're even testing, why we're doing it. So I'm just going to do a quick risk analysis with you all listening. So if I look at the majority of companies, my highest risk is going to be security and security testing. The next one might be load testing, because if there's too much load on the system and it takes the system down, that can be pretty catastrophic. I was looking at some cost metrics for larger enterprise type organizations, and I looked at the average downtime cost of an enterprise organization's instance of SAP will cost about $1 million per hour. So this is a pretty costly one. Number 3 here, I have performance testing. If you are working in kind of e-commerce or something where end users are using your application, it's pretty shocking at how quickly someone will just leave your application and never touch it again if it's too slow. So I have a metric here for you. It's 45% of users will abandon a poorly performing website in under 3 seconds. So that one's pretty important if you're trying to keep customers. And then end-to-end testing. If the thing doesn't work, there's kind of no point in, doing anything else beyond that. And one thing that I've noticed at many companies, if not most companies, is the people doing these different types of testing are a little bit all over the place. So if I look at security testing, people on another team tend to be doing this, and they might give you the result in like a PDF. It's something that's kind of hard to trace and track over time. And maybe I want to see how my project is doing over time. It could be getting worse or better, and I want to see those results somewhere. So if I look at load testing, usually a load testing team, they might give you an HTML dump of results or some other kind of document, but is rarely integrated into however you're tracking all of your other testing. Performance tests, same kind of thing. Maybe they're using JMeter and you have some JMeter specialists. And end-to-end testing, this is still manual. So as much as I hear people doing Selenium tests, it's still manual in the vast majority of cases I see where you're not just testing a website. So if you're testing multiple systems, I'll show you an example in a minute of like ordering a coffee on your mobile app to actually getting that coffee in the store and making sure that whole flow works. That's still a pretty manual process everywhere. So I see a problem with all of these different teams doing their own tests kind of in a silo. I have a little video here. So the #1 rule of motorsports is don't wreck with your teammate, and this was a race from last year, and the two Red Bull cars, my favorite team, hit each other, and that was pretty catastrophic. So when you are doing things with your organization, you should all be one team, and instead of having other teams kind of give you these piecemeal results, one thing you want to do no matter what tool they're using, so if they're using JMeter or other open source tools and some are using proprietary tools, that's fine, but open source isn't going to cover all of this. It's distributed everywhere, but when it's distributed, you don't always have someone with a common understanding of the business value unless you get some sort of visibility in this. These tools are usually not part of any other automated build process, security especially. And it's very common that load testing is done completely separately to when you could for sure be doing your load tests as part of the build process. Even if it's not, the maximum load, you're not stress testing the system, there's no reason you can't include that. And then a lot of this stuff still happens at the very end of the release cycle, which of course is a giant bottleneck and probably what you're all dealing with on a regular basis. And to me, the biggest problem here is there's no shared visibility. Everyone's doing this in a silo. So the #1 thing I would recommend is having a test management tool. So obviously I am, speaking to the choir here. You all probably know this. I've been at a company that had, tens of thousands of automated tests and not too many manual tests, but we had no visibility into what was going on. The load testing team was separate. The security testing team was a third-party company, and we just did not have a good spot to be able to monitor what the heck was happening. So every time, say, I went to go write a new automated test, I wasn't really sure what existed and what didn't exist. So having some sort of centralized visibility into all of the quality metrics, whether or not it's a UI test or not, is key to success in any kind of testing organization. So having this reporting, source of truth, traceability and compliance is obviously important. You need some sort of traceability if you have any kind of life sciences or healthcare compliance or PCI compliance, or if you want to be SOC 2 compliant, you have to have this traceability from requirement to touching production, basically. But you really want to have the security, all those high risk things in there. And your tool can also help you with orchestration. So of course, I have to show you TryCentos Q-Test. That is what is pictured on the right side here. This is the product that I actually purchased 5 years ago at a previous organization. And the reason I work at TryCentos now is this was such a great tool, and I'm a huge believer in it. It does a lot of things, including the traceability and orchestration and the source of truth. But the point here is you can use open source tools You can use proprietary tools, you can use whatever security tools and your JMeter for load testing or whatever it is, as long as the outcome is visible of what you're doing, that's all that really matters in the long run. So when you are deciding to go with an open source tool, you want to make sure that you know your ROI for, okay, well, I'm going to write all these tests. I want to make sure that I'm getting, the best bang for my buck. So if I have a team of 15 people responsible for my open source testing and framework and my load test, my security testing, all that stuff, you want to make sure that you can calculate, okay, well, this is how many bugs we found. This is how much effort we spent working on these frameworks, maintaining these frameworks. So you should just have all these dashboards. So what I would recommend here is having a dashboard all the time for the testing team with some KPIs that are really easy to get. So some obvious examples, and these might be other initiatives that your company has, but the number of automated tests versus manual tests, the number of production bugs found, and the severity of those. So if you find a Sev1 bug, so this is something where like the system is down, there's no workaround, and it's, it can be pretty bad, versus, the number of Sev5 production bugs, which is, maybe a typo or something's not quite the right queue. You want to track the number of bugs found by automation. One bug found by some automated script is always, a thing to celebrate. I recommend you get like a bell at your office or something you can ring when you do that, because it's pretty exciting that all that work pays off. You should also try and calculate the cost of what releasing a Sev1 bug in production is versus the cost of, finding that early. So these are just great things to have if you are trying to make a case for, getting resources on your team or changing products or tools that you're using, whatever it is. These are things that you're going to have to know to be able to make this kind of business case to whoever holds the budget of your group. You'll want to know the cost to hire, retain, train staff. It might be better to train. I've been at organizations where we trained all of the testers to become automation engineers, and we all did open source tools, and that was great. But not everyone necessarily loved it or stayed there. It might be easier to hire people, whatever the case may be. It might be easier to just use a different tool that is easier to train on. The cost to develop and maintain the framework is another metric that you should have, but just figure out whatever makes sense for your business. So I'm going to try and look at a couple of questions here before I get into the last section. Okay, so I got a question for Ishmael about the recommended tools for CI/CD. And then if Appium is outdated and Jenkins is outdated, what are the best recommended tools for CI/CD? So I actually still like Jenkins, but looking at the tool, it's kind of an ugly tool, and it looks like it was written 15 years ago. But it still works really well, and the marketplace in Jenkins is pretty well supported. So I still like Jenkins as kind of a continuous integration orchestration tool, and it is still by far the most popular CI/CD tool out there. There are a lot of companies that have created various pipelines and things like that. Like GitHub has just come out with one. I can't recall the name of it, but GitHub just announced that they are doing one. AWS has one. Atlassian has one. The Atlassian Bamboo CI tool is probably the next most popular one to Jenkins. And then of course, if Jenkins isn't doing exactly what you need, you can always use like the paid version called CloudBees. So CloudBees is a service provider that basically stands up Jenkins for you and gives you the support on top of the open source tool, which is kind of the best of all worlds, because you have a company helping with support and maintenance, but you're still using open source tools. So if something happens to them, you should be able to still reuse all of your stuff. So that's kind of a cool thing that they do. Red Hat's kind of a similar thing with Linux. And then if Appium is outdated and Jenkins, so if Appium is outdated, what might you use is the next part of this question. So I worked at a company that focused on mobile testing prior to working at TryCentos, and we ended up using kind of the native tools for the platform. So on Apple, if you want to do the native testing, I think it's called XC UI test, but you have to know how to do Apple development for that, so it's more expensive. But at that company, it was very important to us that we were always, anytime a new operating system came out, we were always up to date. And then there's another one for Android called Espresso. it's Java, you have to know Java. So it's harder to develop on those frameworks than using a tool like Appium that's really this cross-platform, and there's this nice UI to help, you know, scan the program that you're testing. But it just depends on how important that is to you. Okay, so there's another question from Niladri. I'm sorry about if I messed up your name. If there are any thoughts on open source tools that can be used for testing mobile apps. So the ones that I mentioned just now, XUI Test and Espresso, wouldn't cost you anything else. I don't know if they're considered open source or not. I don't think XUI Test is, but that's okay because it's built into the operating system, so you can count on that being there. And then there's another question, can you recommend security testing tools which are most recommended? I assume you mean open source. This is from Ganesh. Security testing is kind of an interesting problem. It's not a perfectly solved problem yet. You know, a lot of things we've kind of figured out in the testing world. We can automate things. That's a pretty well solved problem. But security testing is pretty immature. I wouldn't say the open source tools are super great for it, but there are some. I'm probably not the best person to list off the names of them. There's a lot of good paid tools, but if I'm, say, doing an analysis of static security tools, and I look at 5 different paid tools, they're all going to give me different results. I did this about a year ago when looking at tools at TryCentos when we were reevaluating new tools. So they all gave me different results. So your best bet is to use as many as possible, open source and proprietary, if security is important to you. So that's my recommendation there. Okay, so I will move on. So I'm getting to the ugly part. There is a lot more to software quality than what I just went over. So I kind of focused on, you know, security, functional, and things like that. But when I look at all the different types of testing that I would need to do to make to feel confident that there's nothing really terribly wrong in my application, end-to-end testing is number one to me. You know, if it doesn't work, nothing else matters. And it becomes kind of a cluster of a mess here when I start looking at all these tests. So security testing, load testing, performance testing, functional UI testing, functional API testing, data integrity testing, test data management, data obfuscation, if I want to be ADA compliant, if I want to be HIPAA compliant, PCI compliant, if I want to have a static code analysis, and there's so much more that I didn't list. There is a lot. It's pretty overwhelming and becomes a bit of a nightmare. So this is the ugly bit. So what I wanted to go through really quickly is what I consider maybe the most important thing to be testing outside of making sure that you have security scans on your code, so you don't do something really, really silly like you know, an obvious security violation and someone hacks in your system. But outside of that, I'd say the most important thing to do is end-to-end testing. So I wanted to run through an end-to-end testing example just so we're all on the same page with what we mean by end-to-end testing. So I'm going to start with, I'll call her Spaceman, Space Girl Annie. It's just the little human character that I had for the slide. She wants a cup of coffee. So she is going to order this cup of coffee on her mobile app. And that mobile app is going to talk to Amazon Web Services, and it's going to use a variety of different services. It's going to use the web service that the app uses. I might send an email, so I might be using Amazon's email service. I might be using SMS to send you a text saying, hey, I got your order. And I'm going to be using some sort of database in the cloud. And then I might be using other third-party services like maybe the Google Address API. Maybe I want to see where you are, and I want to be able to look up where local stores are. So, you know, this could be like a Starbucks or any kind of ordering thing. This is not Starbucks, but it's a similar kind of setup. I might be using Apple Pay's API. I might be using a GPS lookup. I might be using some other payment systems. So I have to integrate with all of these tools. And when I'm doing my end-to-end test, of course, I need to test through all of these. So I'd like to make sure, you know, I can order and my app works fine. I might also want to make sure all the right data is in the database, which might go to some other data warehouse somewhere else in my system, which I also want to verify. I want to make sure I got a text message. I want to make sure my payment got processed or my refund got processed or whatever. But then all of these services are going to talk to a set of shared services somewhere that the rest of the company is using, like maybe the stores are using. I might need to get a list of stores from the store API. I might want to get a list of orders, payments. I need to know that I am a real user, and I might need to get my history. I might have some star points, reward, something system to tell me I got some coupon for a free coffee. So there's a whole lot of systems that also need to be verified. They all need API testing. But then the other side of this, where things get kind of tricky, is inside of the store, I have some sort of point of sale machine set up. And if any of you on this webinar have ever worked with these kinds of systems, depending on your company, they're often extremely outdated or very old or connected to some archaic system in the back end. And that system inside the store has some local store server just in case like my internet goes out, right? So I have to have some local service. I have to have some sort of queue that sends all of my messages to the shared services when it goes back online. I need a local database or flat file or whatever I'm storing this in. That's going to talk to my payment processing systems like a First Data or Fiserv or something. And only then can I, actually fulfill the order and give the coffee to this person. So there, you can imagine, connections between all of these different services. And I want to verify end to end, I can order this. And then I go in the store, I want to automate setting this guy up, and I want to, validate like, oh, maybe I got my order wrong. I need to do a refund. Did I get my points back? So there's so many different scenarios that you really need this full end-to-end testing flow done. So this is what we talk about when we're talking about end-to-end. So the question is, how do you automate this stuff in the first place? You're testing different platforms, different operating systems, in a very complicated setup. You need to be looking at your database. Sometimes when you're doing payment testing, it's not obvious on the front end that everything was right. You might actually have to look in the database for validations. And a full test will include validating things like refunds in this scenario, of course. So you absolutely can do this stuff with open source tools completely, but it would be very difficult. You'd have to orchestrate different tools together because you're not going to be able to use the same programming languages and frameworks to automate all of this stuff. I have never seen someone do this successfully, and I absolutely would not do it. It would be way too time consuming. There are definitely tools that do this for you and do it without so much pain and orchestration. So this is where I have to talk about our company, TryCentos, and how we have this really great product called TryCentos Tosca, that for this end-to-end testing scenario, we are like the best that you could get for something like this. We support 160 plus different technologies. That includes things from like, okay, well, we support SAP and Oracle and big prepackaged systems like that, Salesforce, but we also support like Java and C# and API testing. And so if you have a custom Java application or custom C# application written in WPF or a common framework in C#, we can support all that custom stuff and automate it. So I'm very proud of this. So you should know that this exists, and you don't have to write all of this stuff from scratch. And although I'm a developer, I would 100% of the time, if I'm doing that kind of end-to-end testing, I would absolutely use something like this. If I am just testing a website, I might use something like Selenium, depending on how big the application is and how complicated it might get, because sometimes it's hard to maintain all that stuff in code. So what you'll see on a really large application, you might want something that's visual, where you can set up a nice folder structure of what the heck you are testing, what models that you have, and things like that. So the other really cool thing that Tosca has to help you support is it helps you stabilize that testing environment. So if I go back to the end-to-end diagram that I drew, there are arrows in between all of those services from my mobile app. There are arrows in between services and those shared services. There's arrows between that point of sale system and my queue. And there's a lot of stuff that if I want to do end-to-end testing on a regular basis, which I'm claiming is the most important kind of testing out there other than maybe security testing, you really need to have this stable test environment so you can run the core of your test. And in order to set up a stable testing environment, I'm sure most of you have issues with this all the time where like service X is down or the correct version isn't deployed. And so like you can't run your end-to-end test because they'll just break early on. So you need to set up that stable environment. And the way you can do that, or you can absolutely do that, you can use tools for it. You can fake endpoints It's not a bad thing to fake endpoints. You can actually set up a fake endpoint so that it can try the real service. If the service is down, it can fake the endpoint only in that scenario. If it's up, it can still pass all the data to your real service and make sure that you are notified when it's down. And the way you do this is with something called orchestrated service virtualization. There are other ways to do it called like mocking and stubbing, which are kind of quote unquote dumb ways to do it. It's not dumb that you're doing it, but they're not intelligent solutions. The OSV, orchestrated service virtualization, actually is an intelligent way to figure out, well, is your service running or not? If it is not running, I can say, well, make sure to log a user in. So maybe I want to log myself into a system. So I log in, I hit the API endpoint to log in Elise. And then I say in the next call, all right, I want to get Elise's, history of, coffee orders. And so it knows that I am the one that I logged in, and it can take my same user that I requested into the next API call. So it kind of keeps variables for me throughout multiple calls. So it chains my service requests together. So that's what makes it very interesting. So you should know that this is built into Tosca as well. We have a whole section just for OSV and orchestrated testing. So that is a very, very cool thing. No matter, you can use open source tools for some of this. You could use Tosca for some of it. You could, do whatever makes sense in your environment for your tool set. But regardless of how you do that, something like OSV is required to really get a stable end-to-end environment set up. So that was the point I wanted to make there. So that was about the last slide. I just have a summary here. So I want to just review the good, bad, and the ugly. So the good of the open source is it's cheap. There's lots and lots of choices, and it's very, very popular for web testing, especially, and for load testing with JMeter. But there are, of course, other solutions. The bad part is you're kind of on your own. So it's cool that you're not relying on a company to do anything for you, but if that tool doesn't cut it, you have to go modify that tool yourself. And then it gets pretty expensive because these open source projects, some of them are very big, some of them have been around for a while. So if you want to go touch Selenium or JMeter or something, or Jenkins, they are pretty massive projects. And then the ugly is there's not great open source solutions for end-to-end testing if you have more than one operating system or type of application you're testing. So a mobile and a web, or like a mainframe and a website or SAP instance or something. So that is pretty much all I have. I will say that I went to UNC Chapel Hill and I bleed Carolina blue. That is why that's good. If you want to put in the chat why dark blue is ugly, I would love to see that. So that's all I have. All right, so feel free to ask questions. I'm going to go, there's a number in here, so I'm going to scroll through these and see how many I can get through in the next 5 minutes or so. Okay. Ishmael mentioned that Azure DevOps provides multiple integrated gates from CI to continuous testing. That's absolutely true. Azure DevOps is kind of the new iteration of TFS or VSTS. And they have a lot of things built in. They don't necessarily have quite the breadth of the testing built in, but they are a pretty exciting tool if you live in the Microsoft world. We have a question from Kieran about what automation testing approach should I use for microservices and container projects. It's not really going to be different than any other kind of API testing tools. So you can certainly use open source API testing tools. You can write it yourself. So I've done this kind of testing in JavaScript, but then you're writing your own framework. You can also use a tool like Tosca to do API testing. You can also use a free tool like Postman to do API testing. So it sort of depends on how big your project is and how much structure you want around your tests. So there's a question from Kabira about asking if these tools are for developers or testers. Are there any tools you recommend for functional and system testing? So if your testers are technical, then you can use open source tools. If your testers are not so technical, open source tooling is probably not the best solution. unless you want to train your staff to be able to write code. All the open source solutions, other than, I don't know, maybe something like JMeter, really requires development skill set. So you can train, if you don't have a highly technical testing team and they really understand the business of what you're doing, they understand how to manually test it, then a tool like Tosca is absolutely the way you want to go, because you just learn a tool and then you can run your automation, which is kind of the big value proposition, of course, of testing, is to be able to automate all the boring stuff that you keep repeating over and over again. Okay, so there's some more questions here. So let me see what I can get to. And some of them I don't necessarily know. So David asked a question, do you support the testing of Microsoft Dynamics? Probably, if it's a CRM, most likely we would with Tosca. Feel free to just go to our website, TryCentos.com, and send us that question and someone will answer it for you right away. So Ishmael says Tosca is #1 tool on Gartner, but it is expensive. That's a true story. It's, you know, we're not an open source. We don't have open source tools that we let you see the code of, although we do have less expensive tools for automation, like Test Project I touched on at the very beginning, which you're welcome to check out. Tosca is a true enterprise grade tool, so it's you get a lot of support with it, as well as the functional testing. We got a question from Lorenzo about accessibility testing. There was a tool that I had on one of my early slides here. Let me see if I know which one. PA11Y is one of these logos. This one, I know that's pretty popular for accessibility testing. I think it only does web accessibility. So that's something you take a look at. It kind of depends on the platform that you are testing as far as accessibility. So there were 2 people that asked that question. Okay, so I think that's all I can answer. There are a couple questions about tools and pricing and things like that. If you're interested in any of the TryCentos products, I'm thrilled, and that's fantastic. Go to TryCentos.com and you can request a demo or send us an email and ask us whatever you'd like. We're quite responsive. So that is all I had, unless Charlene, you had any questions for me.
I don't have any questions for you, but I do want to remind the audience that we do have an Amazon gift card drawing. So if you are in a good place, Elise, I can go ahead and do that now.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. As I mentioned at the top of the hour, we are doing a drawing for 3 $50 Amazon gift cards. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get that done. The first winner of the $50 gift card is Derry Engel. Congratulations, Derry. Our second winner is Stephen Labnick. Congratulations, Stephen. And our third and final winner today is, let's see, I know I'm going to butcher this last name, so I apologize. Anelia Chitilanovia. I think I got it. Maybe, probably not. Sorry about that, Anelia, but congratulations anyway. I also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the event, or if you just want to listen to it again, you have the opportunity to do so. After today's webinar, we're going to be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. The webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website, so you can always go there. Just go to DevOps.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Elise, thanks for giving such a great presentation. I love your little GIFs throughout and all that fun stuff. So congratulations. It's such a great presentation. And judging from the number of questions we got, I know the audience got a lot out of it too. So thanks again. Also want to thank the audience for joining me today. And this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.